Welcome to Keeping It Green, a podcast for ornamental plant professionals and enthusiasts, with hosts Margaret Pickoff and Tom Butzler.
Hello, and welcome to Keeping It Green, a podcast from Penn State Extension for ornamental plant professionals and enthusiasts. I'm one of your hosts, Margaret Pickoff. I'm a horticulture educator with Penn State Extension, and on each episode, I'm joined by my colleagues on the green industry team as co-hosts. On today's episode, my co-host is Tom Butzler. Hi, Tom.
Hey, Margaret.
We're going to be talking to two of our colleagues on this episode, Ruth Benner and Margaret Hoffman. But before we get to our interview with Ruth and Margaret, we'll start out with a little check-in about what we're doing and seeing at this time, where it's right before Thanksgiving. So, Tom, what are you doing and seeing in Central PA?
Yeah, well, we started to get some rains. I mean, the middle part of this year was really hot and dry. And I think we've talked about this before on some of our previous podcasts, but it's going to be interesting to see what's going to happen to some of our trees as we get into these very hot growing seasons. Are we going to see more stress, more mortality out there? I mean, I'm starting to see it on the mountainsides where we've had some spongy moth infestations, and then you throw in some of these really dry, hot months, and some of these trees are really starting to hurt. So it's going to be survival of the fittest, I suppose. So we'll see which ones, make it through these growing seasons. I guess the other thing of note, kind of a fun thing, is I planted some pawpaw trees several years ago, and they've really been throwing off a lot of fruit. And been harvesting some of those pawpaws the past couple weeks. I mean, it's over now. It's a different tasting fruit. It's a native one, and I think you acquire a taste to it. So I've been eating it and trying to come up with some interesting ways to make some recipes with it. So I guess stay tuned. We'll see how that works out.
Wow, I love pawpaws. And I've never done anything with them except just eat them raw. But I think part of it is like getting the ripeness just right, because if you try eating it too early, it's like you really have to wait till it gets like soft and kind of gooey.
Yep. I started a bunch from seedlings or from seeds, so I'll give you one next year. I'll give you a couple next year. You can start your own pawpaw patch.
Oh, wow, cool. That would be great. Yeah.
So what's going on your
that.
the eastern part of the state?
Yeah, so here in Philly, we've also gotten a little bit of rain, not nearly enough, but we've definitely had a shift in the weather, the temperature. We were just talking before we started recording about how it's been a little gloomy lately, statewide, and we need some sun. But yeah, for me, the sort of field-based season has wound down, so not getting as many client questions, but shifting more towards event programming for the winter, which is exciting. And it's early, but just to put this out there is that our Green Industry Conference that we hold in the Philly area at Temple Ambler every year usually is the first week of January, so it's right after New Year's. This year, based on some feedback from our participants and folks who do snow removal in the winter, we've actually pushed that back to March. So it's going to be March 5th this year. We have a really great schedule of speakers, including one of our guests today, Margaret Hoffman, who's going to come out and speak for us, and Tim Abbey, who's in the background of today's podcast. But yeah, great schedule of speakers. I'm really excited for that conference. I think it's going to be super fun. So it's a great time of year because we get to sort of put on our planning hats and come up with some great programs for the winter. And as long as we get enough sun and make it through the winter, we'll have some cool stuff going on in the spring.
It's always winter meetings nice to get out there and present some of this material, but it's also great networking with our clientele, with folks that work in the green industry. So,
yeah, it's always good to see everybody after the busy season.
Yeah.
Great. Well, it's nice to catch up with you, Tom. I'm glad you're here today. And so let's shift to our conversation with Ruth and Margaret. Just by way of a really quick introduction of both of these folks, Ruth Benner is a commercial horticulture educator on the green industry team, just like me and Tom. She's based in Erie County, and her work focuses on plant ID, greenhouse and nursery production, IPM, and so we're really excited to have her on today. Margaret Hoffman might be a familiar name because Margaret was actually our first podcast guest 3 years ago, which is hard to believe, but we had Margaret on to talk about natural swimming pools all those years ago, and now she's back. She's an associate professor in the Department of Plant Science at Penn State, and she specializes in landscape contracting, landscape design, green roofs, landscape construction, lots of cool stuff. And the reason we've invited Ruth and Margaret on the show today is to talk about overseas horticultural explorations. So, both of our guests have traveled to Europe and beyond and have seen some amazing gardens, arboreta, other sorts of plantscapes around. And so we thought it would be fun to invite them on and kind of talk to them about their travels and what they've seen and observed. So welcome. That was a long introduction, but welcome, Ruth and Margaret. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having us.
So I figured we could start out with just a little intro to how you relate to this topic of traveling internationally to see plants and realizing that that might not be the only reason you're traveling internationally, but since we're a plant podcast, that'll be our focus today. But yeah, could you tell us, where you've been recently and kind of broadly what sorts of plants and settings you've kind of seen cool plants in the last couple years, and maybe we'll start with Ruth and then we'll jump to Margaret.
Okay, so, well, most recently, I just earlier this month, I took a my first cruise. And so we sailed from Miami to the Dominican Republic, and there was a mountain called Mount Isabel Torres, a mountain that we drove up to the mountaintop and got to see the tropical plants, bromeliads, and orchids growing through this tropical forest. And then a nice comparison was when we got back to Miami, we spent a couple days there and got to see Fairchild Botanical Gardens and a museum and garden called Vizcaya, and where there's a historic house and you get to appreciate the architecture. And it has this wonderful, um, like central courtyard that had at one time been an open courtyard in the center of the house. It's been enclosed since, but you get to tour the house, and then nice thing about houses as part of gardens is you get to see the garden from different views, different elevations in the house. So that was my most recent trip where I got to see tropical gardens both in the US and in the Dominican Republic. Um, Earlier this year, I got to go to England. Got to have my second visit to Wisley Gardens while I was there. Also got to visit a couple other like historic houses. Blenheim Palace was one of them. And so you get to see the house, you get to see the surrounding garden and how that garden, well, the whole landscape was designed around the home so that the homeowner would get to view the different places. So typically when I travel, it's usually around some kind of work event for my partner. So he usually is going to a conference and I get to tag along on the trip. And so wherever he's going, I instantly go, okay, we're going to the UK. Here's garden, what gardens are near that city? Um, and in the UK, I usually don't just look for botanical gardens, I also look for parks because public parks often have some formal garden as part of them. I also look for other things like the National Trust. The National Trust is a program where kind of people get into a partnership with the government or with this trust to overtake part of the cost of maintaining their estate. Sometimes the families can still live in the home or part of the home, but then they open up that historic home to visitors to both the home and the gardens, and it helps to maintain them. It also helps to offset, I guess, the amount of taxes they owe the government. So, but you can join the National Trust as an American. They have like a non-English membership that, you know, if you're going to visit at least two of the homes while you're traveling, it's worth the cost to just join because then you can go to all of them under that membership. So that's usually what I do. I look for gardens that fall under that, under the National Trust or other really well-known gardens, like any of the gardens that are part of the Royal Horticulture Society.
Margaret?
Well, so my motivation originally for going to the gardens that I've visited in both Ireland and England, particularly, was more education motivated. So I was either bringing students or I was developing materials that I could use in my classes, specifically like the landscape design courses. And so the first time I went to England, um, I went to all like the RHS gardens, the Royal Horticultural Society gardens, and then also went to some of the National Trust. But I sort of targeted those that had famous landscape designers like Vita Sackville-West or Gertrude Jekyll, Edwards Lutyens, uh, people that the students should know about. And then I filmed the gardens using a 360 camera. So, and created these tours of them so the students could put the headsets on and then experience the gardens, walk through during the tour and see the different highlights of the garden. And hoping that would help them to understand how really good designers use principles and elements of design when they're, creating a garden. And so the first time was I basically went to Kew and then Sissinghurst, which is Vita Sackville West, and then Great Dixter, which was Christopher Lloyd, and now Fergus Garrett is in charge there. And then Gravetye Gardens, which is actually attached to a Michelin star restaurant and a wonderful hotel. And that's where William Robinson made his home when he wrote The Wild Garden, which is kind of a classic. And where else did I go after that? That was a shorter trip, and I think I went to Hyde Park and Kensington Gardens in London, and also toured the uh, Tower of London because the moat had been just turned into this like a super bloom by Nigel Dunnett. So I wanted to see that also. So that was kind of my maiden voyage to the world of gardening in England. And then that was in October. So the next May, I went also and went to the same gardens and did the filming so that we could see how the plant material presented, in both spring and fall. And then for my planting design course, students could see, how great designers design for really, all the seasons. So there's interest throughout the year. And so I went to all those gardens again, but that time I added Sheffield Park. I'm trying to remember all the ones I've been to. Sheffield Park was basically it's a private estate, National Trust, and it has a beautiful, beautiful home that's still lived in, and uh, a lake and a beautiful, like it's mainly the whole big landscape effect is what they're going for there. Um, I also went to Hever Castle and Garden, which was where Anne Boleyn was raised.
Oh,
So that was interesting.
yeah.
And that was a fascinating garden also because you got to see the castle and the old Tudor residence, and then see the garden, which has gone through many iterations in its lifetime. So that was really fascinating. Um, and I think that, I added Hampton Court that year too, which is the palace and garden. So you're right, Ruth. Going through that palace was like, it really adds to your sense of the surrounding landscape. And for one thing, you just know looking at the landscape that they had a small army of people living there that were doing nothing but taking care of that landscape. Because, I mean, you never could have managed it otherwise. And that had, I mean, many wonderful gardens attached to Hampton Court, but one that was my personal favorite was the Rose Garden. I just have a soft spot in my heart for roses. So, and it was in full bloom when I was there. And that again was in May. And then this last May, I brought students over and one of the joys of that trip was seeing how they viewed the gardens and how they recognized things that they had learned in their time at Penn State, in design courses and plant ID courses that they thought they were never going to use ever, but they went to these gardens and they'd be like, "Oh, I remember when you talked about this, and this is that principle and element of design, and this is that plant," and they just loved it. Like at the end of the 10 days that we were there and I asked them what their favorite garden was, I mean, they honestly could not pick one. We went to, of course, brought them to Kew, Whistler, and they loved Whistler, just loved it with a passion. And then we went to Gertrude Jekyll's garden, Hestercombe. We went to Hidcote Manor. Then we went to Beth Chatto's, which is a whole different kind of thing. So Beth Chatto was the person who kind of first started the right plant, right place movement. And, basically felt that if you created the environment that that plant um, had been growing in and had developed, over time, evolved in, if you created that environment in your garden, they would be fine. And so she had like gravel Mediterranean gardens, she had wetland gardens, she had woodland areas, and they really loved that one. Then we went down to Sissinghurst, Great Dixter. I think they universally felt like Great Dixter was like, it almost was overwhelming to them because there were so many plants there. And it's so lush. And it's not, in landscape contracting, they're often taught, to really control their gardens, to manicure them, to use pruning, which Great Dixter does. They have some great like yew hedges that are, I think it's amazing how often they actually are pruned. But they have walls, they have passageways, they have, they're like trimmed into bird shapes, just amazing. But then all the other areas are just full of this tapestry of plants. And I think it was overwhelming for them. For me, that's the kind of thing I like, so I loved it. They were just kind of like, wow, there's so much here. They didn't even know what to do with it. Um, and then after they went home, I stayed because I wanted to look at some gardens that I hadn't seen before to see if, like, the next time I bring students, if we should change it up a little. So I went more like to the southwest. Yeah, southwest this time. So I went to the Lost Gardens of Helgan, which was amazing. So that's a garden that actually was was part of an estate, and then in World War One, the all the gardeners basically went to the front, um, and almost none of them made it back. And
Mm.
so, because everyone on the estate was like family, like the owner just couldn't, like he just didn't want to maintain the garden anymore. The estate sort of fell into disuse, and then like in the past 20 years, they went back in, when the estate was purchased, they went back in and they found the bones of the old garden basically, and they just renewed it. And it's it's really pretty amazing. So I highly recommend, like, that one's definitely going to be on our list for next time I bring the students. I also went to Stourhead, which is more of the classic, landscape garden, basically with big vistas. It's all about the views that they created. Um, and there was a really neat garden called the Garden House, which I had never heard of before, but I'm so glad I found. It was just like this gem um, in this area called Yelverton. And it was just so worth going to. And then I walked from there to another garden called the Wild Side, which is by Keith Wiley, who is sort of a modern garden genius in England. And that was like totally different than the garden house, but yet like had a lot of the same plant material. So it was, but used in a different way. So that was fascinating. And then where'd I go from there? Um, oh, I went to the RHS Rosemore, which I'd never been to, which is way on the western coast, almost by Cornwall. And that was another just amazing experience. So you can hardly go wrong, honestly, when you're gardening and when you're visiting gardens in England. And I agree with you, Ruth. Like sometimes the most fun, like in London, London is such a walkable city. Just walk everywhere. And you'll just see these little gardens and little green spaces tucked in between buildings. Like there's one that's by, I think it's called Greyfriars, and it was a bombed out hospital, during World War II. But it's a very old, went back hundreds of years that it was a hospital. And so they created out of the wreckage basically a pocket park. And it's really beautiful. Just a little green space that they created so that the people in London City can, enjoy and relax, maybe eat their lunch there or something. So,
Mm.
So listening to you two talk, I've realized I've done very little international travel and have visited zero gardens overseas. So that's something I guess I have to start doing. But I've visited plenty stateside gardens and arboretums and managed places. Is there a difference, when you're here in the United States and you go to some of these overseas? Let's just use the ones in England that you've talked about extensively here. Is there a different philosophy on how they're, and I think you kind of briefly mentioned this, but how they're managed, how they're laid out, how they're designed, and then how the public interacts? Do you see a difference in the United States versus over in these gardens in England? Either of you.
I would say to some extent, but even in the United States, we're an immense country. Like England's not, England itself is not that much bigger than Pennsylvania, but they have everywhere you go, wherever you are traveling, you can find these estates and gardens to go to. So it seems to be much more part of their culture that um, the aesthetic of gardening is very important in their culture, um, not just at the estates, but also in the towns. People tend to have like fences and walled gardens even around their own private property, where we tend to have much more open land here. But when I would go to these gardens, whether they were National Trust or if they were, kind of self-run, there was a lot of volunteer workers that were there to learn or there for community to help maintain them. So I think that's part of how they maintain them. But I do see that to an extent here too. Some of our public gardens have a lot of volunteer base where they're there to learn and to get their hands on plants. They might not have the land to have their own garden, and so they get the opportunity to learn and do. So I'm not sure if that's really a difference, but I think maybe the people's interest in volunteering there might be a little greater because it just seems, when I'm in there, I mean, I hate to make generalizations because when I'm visiting England, it's there for a snapshot in time, and I usually am kind of blown away by all the plants and all the designs and just trying to take everything in. But I do occasionally listen to the humans around me at the gardens too. And you'll hear them saying the names of plants. Like they're not looking for the tags. They know what they are. They seem to have just uh, a horticultural awareness that I don't generally hear here. And even when I do like go to a public garden here, people are enjoying the outdoor space, and I might hear people talking about the plants, but it seems like people are out for a stroll with their family and enjoying the day in an outdoor space. Where when I'm in England, I'll hear people discussing the plants or discussing the designs to a greater extent. And I referred to my partner earlier. He's really not a plant guy. And so when we go to these gardens, he'll look at things that we have in our own yard. It happens all the time that we have the exact same plant in our yard. He walks by it, doesn't know it's there, but he'll see it in the garden and go, "What, what's that?" And I'll say, "Well, a lot of times I say the Latin name because I can't come up with a common name quickly." And in England, I've had people walk by and go, "Hey, that's spot on. That's what it is." And like, they don't just know the common names. They seem to know the Latin names. Just people very, freely can whip out those Latin names. And I'm like, wow, how great would this be to have friends who just want to walk through gardens and actually talk about nomenclature with me? That would be pretty exciting because I haven't run into that too much among my friend set here.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah,
it sounds like Ruth, you need to take your partner and tour your garden at home. Show them the plants.
I've
Yeah. So, Margaret,
tried.
you think the same thing with your experiences?
yeah. I do think that the average person visiting an RHS garden or a National Trust garden is more informed than our average visitor who goes to our public gardens. Um, I mean, I definitely get that sense. And I think part of it is also they have that allotment system. So in almost every small town or large town, they have like empty lots that they designate as allotments, and you can apply for a plot in the allotment, um, and then you can put in a garden, and you have to maintain it. So normally they're putting it in for vegetables, but
Hmm.
they also will put, some ornamental plants in there just to make it pretty too. And this is so one of the places I visited was Clovelly, which is this little town on the western coast. And it has no motorized vehicles or anything. It's the original cobblestones. It's built on the side of this hill, and then the harbor's right below it. Um, I think it's one of the oldest incorporated villages that's still intact in England. It used to be like associated with a monastery, and then in the dissolution, when Henry VIII took property away from like religious orders. He gave it to a noble family and gave the village to the noble family, and that village or that family still has the responsibility for that village and the abbey house that they own. And so it's a fascinating place, but these are old houses, old cobblestone streets, but they still have an allotment. And these people who are actually renting the houses from that family, that was granted the village, they still have their little allotments. And like the place that I stayed, the little bed and breakfast that I stayed there, that woman was just recovering from Lyme disease because she was out working in her allotment and she got a tick.
Got a tick. Yeah.
Yeah. But her little courtyard in front of the bed and breakfast was one of the most beautiful little places, that I had ever, had the fortune to stay in. And she had all these plants and, um, it's just part of their
Yeah,
culture.
you wonder, is that something that's brought up through the family, or is that something in their education system where they have, something on horticulture or plant biology and an emphasis on it,
I
something that we don't do?
I don't know if it's part of their education or if it's something that they are brought up with. But the other thing I would say is they tend to have, as a society, more of a respect for like a being a gardener is a respected position,
Mm,
you know. Whereas, like for instance, if you say you're a landscaper, people don't necessarily think that that's like,
okay, that's
you know,
interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
anything to write home about. But there, like being a gardener, that's pretty respected. So
Hmm.
there is a difference societally in that sense, I think.
And I think even like their mainstream, like Gardener's World is a television show that
Oh,
it's streamed prime time Friday nights.
Is that
We can
Monty
watch it.
Don?
Yeah, Monty Don. You can
Okay.
watch it the next morning here
really?
in the US on BritBox, or you can watch older episodes on other streaming services. But that's, usually 8 or 9 o'clock Friday nights.
Wow.
That's what people will watch. And it's very popular there. They have their own uh, garden show. There's other garden shows, the Hampton Court Garden Show, Chelsea Garden Show, which is probably the most famous. But they have a number of them all over the country. Our garden events are usually like home and garden show, and it's mostly like somebody selling you spas
Yeah.
and siding and new roofing material, and there might be one or two landscapers and a handful of plants, but their garden shows are focused around the
Hmm.
plants, the horticulture, the design, and not just, oh, it looks pretty, but there's usually like a lot of concept into it. Like each one usually garden has a focus on maybe something environmental or something concerning mental health. And people often, when you like go to the garden show and listen to people around you, people have already read or heard about who this designer designed this, and this is, this pathway was designed to illustrate this idea of going through the recovery process for something. Like the people around them, who are around you at these garden shows, they kind of know what they want to see, and they're there to get ideas. And I think that's very, very different than when I've gone to garden shows here. It's more like, what can I buy? And what contractor can I get a contract with, or a special show rate? So I think that's very different. Of course, you can buy plants, but I can't smuggle them home. So I don't, so I don't, so I just browse through that.
That is the limitation of international garden
Oh,
viewing. You
it's a
can't just, oop, I'm gonna.
big, like, especially working for extension, I'm always like, oh, I could take this seed, but I don't want to be the person who brought home whatever weevil is in hiding out in that
Yes.
seed and start a whole new problem. So yeah, I just take pictures and leave the plants there. But uh,
Yeah, I think, my students, when they were looking at the plants, the one genus that really amazed them was salvias. Like, I tell them when we're teaching perennials and annuals, like this is a really large genus. This is really large. We only grow a small fraction of them, and especially commercially available here. They're walking through these gardens and they're like, what is this? And I'm like, that's salvia, blah, blah, blah. And then they're like, what is this? Oh, that's salvia, another one. And they just are amazed at all the different ways that genus expresses itself.
Mm.
So yeah, it's
well,
it's a
that
lot.
that makes me think of another benefit that they do have that makes horticulture a little more tangible is their seasons,
Yeah.
what they can grow there. I definitely get zone envy when I'm there because they can grow a lot of things that we couldn't grow here in Pennsylvania or that our season's just much too short for.
Well,
Mm.
in
Um,
part of their, country, they can actually grow tropicals, like parts of Cornwall,
Huh?
even though they have very tough, weather at times, they still are able, they use garden walls very well, right? Like they both plant-based walls and, like hardscaped brick walls. And there's a lot of advantages to them. They help protect from sea spray, from salt, from desiccating winds. They keep, warmth in. They radiate heat when it does get cold. So they really are the masters of
Hmm.
using garden walls.
You've both
Creating microclimates.
Yeah.
Oh,
And
spit
and
into
I
mine.
mean, and using them to add to the overall ambiance of the garden too, like contribute to the garden design.
you've both talked a little bit about the sort of historical context of a lot of these gardens, and that's something I'm kind of curious about as another potential difference between what we've got going on in the US, which again is like very broad, as Ruth pointed out, it's a huge country, versus in the UK. And I'm kind of in an interesting spot because I live in Philly and we have gardens here that are as old as or older than the founding of our country, that were started by usually men who, even if they were born in Philly, they were maybe one generation away from being English, and so are very sort of seem to be very influenced by the sort of uh, English view of gardens and interested in interesting plant collections from around the world and uh, you know, just amassing these collections on their personal estates, and then those estates became gardens at a certain point. In the Philly area, we also have a lot of famous gardens that were the estates of industry leaders, of like railroad people, I guess, I don't know, people who had tobacco empires and things like that. And maybe their wife was really interested in roses, so they have this rose garden or something like that. But it's a little bit more, a little bit newer. And the collections seem to be a little bit more like American, even though I don't totally know why or how. But I just wonder, in terms of the plant collections themselves, like how does history sort of impact what we see today, with these two kind of separate approaches um, to making a garden?
Hmm. Well, I think in England, I mean, they definitely went through different like design periods in gardens. And I mean, the gardens that we're mostly familiar with were often wealthy people, right? Just like in Philly. The wealthy people could afford to have a garden that was just there for their enjoyment, right? And they could afford to pay a big staff to take care of that garden. Now, a lot of wealthy families, like the woman, that's the project they took on. They would do the design, like Vita Sackville West, or Gertrude Jekyll for that matter. But I think that's probably true to some extent in the US also, is that the larger gardens started with wealthy families who could afford both to send someone out to collect the most interesting plants, and that added to their cachet, basically. And then, you know, often it was driven by the wife's personal tastes in garden, which were often driven by the English garden um, styles. So it's it's kind of interesting, I think, how they have still maintain that, but now it's like no one can afford to maintain that huge a staff. So they've had to do things to make them manageable. And also, now people, it's more accessible to the average person, right? So like if in Colonial Williamsburg, the gardens there, they didn't have gardens. They just had grew vegetables. I mean, they are gardens, but they certainly didn't have gardens that were there for aesthetics.
Hmm.
Every space was there to help them survive, basically. So they'd have their livestock and then their vegetable gardens. Um, and it's only when we started having the time to actually put in a garden for our own enjoyment. You had to have the time, you had to have the money, and you had to have the land to be able to do that. So I don't know. I would really like to study what motivated the two gardens, for the average person in like here versus Europe. Because I think there's just something subtly different, and I don't can't really put my finger on it. I don't know. Ruth, you probably have a better take on that.
I don't know if I do. I mean, I agree with everything you said i- as far as, if you're wealthy, you can afford to put on the show and one up other, it was a lot of it was like,
Keep up with the
oh,
Joneses.
his pond and fountain is this big. My vista is going to be even bigger. Um, you see some like when I'm in France, you can see differences in design. Like, oh, like yeah, we're going to have these formal gardens, but lots of curves. Where in England, you see a lot of like right angles and
Hmm.
long straight passageways. The knot gardens are straighter. Um, I see differences with that, but in American gardens, it seems like a lot of times we're taking pieces from what they saw when they were on their grand tours of Europe. Like, here's what I saw in England. I want this, or here's what I saw. And like, if you think about Disney World as being a garden, because it's beautiful there. That a lot of that was taken from Tivoli Gardens in Denmark. And when you're there, you can see pieces of it that is like, oh yeah, I can see how Walt Disney saw pieces of this and took this to design Disneyland. So I think we take a lot of pieces of what we admire from different landscapes and piece them together. And so a lot of times it seems like American gardens might be a little slightly more eclectic. Um,
Hmm.
Like
but
more of a
I guess
patchwork,
I
maybe.
don't know, because Margaret, you've been to lots of places like when you're in England, you see a lot of follies where they're taking pieces of what they saw maybe in Roman ruins, the columns from Roman or Greek ruins, and making follies out of them to put in their English gardens. So I guess it's something that they've done as well, where as they traveled and saw Europe, they took pieces of what, oh, I admire this, and this represents power and money. I mean, what represents money more than having a folly, something that's like a structure that has no
No
purpose
purpose.
other than to look like to be a focal point in a landscape, but it really doesn't have any other purpose. And that's pretty much the height of um I guess they have one in Chanticleer, don't they? They have a
Yeah.
folly that they built a
Mm.
ruins just to be a focal point,
Wow.
and it's
I feel like
absolutely
you can
charming.
learn a lot about human psychology through
Yeah.
garden design. Like this is what humans value and are drawn to.
I
Um,
think so. I think like for me, the idea of enclosure is something like I think one of my first like fantasies in my head of what I wanted a garden to be was from the book The Secret Garden, where the little girl discovers the key to a walled garden and takes it over. I read that as a child, and then when you go to England, you get to see a lot of these walled gardens,
Mhm.
and you have that sense of safety and enclosure in these enclosed spaces. It's really charming, and I think that speaks to psychology. Like, how do I feel when I'm
Yeah.
in this garden?
Yeah, and actually that's one of the things that I think the students realize when I teach garden rooms. Like you create garden rooms because they tend to be more functional and also you can decorate them, right? You can make them yours. You know, put your stamp on them basically. But they create a sense of security for people to be enclosed, right?
Mhm.
You don't want it to be stifling, but you want to at least give them that feeling of security. And that really came home to them in the gardens, because almost every English garden we went to had that sense of enclosure. Some of them were maybe larger scale, but would still have a portion that would be, smaller. And I think there's a lot of things like I'm just thinking of things that I've brought home. So like at Gravetie, where William Robinson was, they have this vegetable garden that's like amazing. And it that they use all the produce in their award-winning restaurant. Even like the flowers they grow for, to be put into salads or desserts or whatever. And they have the main path is lined with espaliered apple trees, but they're this high. So they're a fence that's only like not even as high as my knees that go along both sides of the path, and they have different types of, apples. And then all the walls that enclose it, they have espaliered fig trees, they have espaliered apples, they have, almost any type of fruit you can think of. Um, and so, and then also like other gardens, they do pleaching a lot to create alleys. And I'm in a small property up here in State College, and I'm looking at like there's a fence, but it's like a split rail fence. But I'm like, I think I'm going to start a higher level fence that'll be pleach trees to go along the back. So it'll still give me that sense of privacy and enclosure, but also be something different and, kind of fun. So, you know, I wouldn't have thought of doing that if I hadn't visited those gardens.
Mm. Wow.
It-
Well,
Have you
I
been to
think
Ham House, Margaret?
No.
Ham House is pretty close to London. It's worth the trip. I think you'd like it. They have the espaliered apples and the walled vegetable garden. Um, but they have the pleached trees. I think it's Carpinus that's pleached. And
Hmm.
then under it, they have Taxus, and it just shows you how much shade Taxus can grow in. But you have this lower shaded level of a Taxus hedge, and then maybe a foot or two of clearance so you can kind of see through the tunnel, and then almost a tunnel of the pleached trees that you walk through. And so I know my enthusiasm for gardening is really high until about July. And then
Yeah.
July and August, it wanes a bit, and I question, is this really what my passion in life is? Um, and it seems like a lot of the English gardens have a lot more space dedicated to like, here's a pathway of shelter.
Mm.
Um, in this, even though there could be really functional gardens where they're growing their own food, they also have these areas of comfort that I'm like, th those are some of the ideas I steal and want to bring home is how can I have these comfortable little nooks through my garden where I still can enjoy being outside in July?
Well,
Mm.
to that point, one of the things that I always looked at as a failure of mine as a landscaper, a gardener, and I'm just talking about my own property. So we'd walk through every night, go through the whole property. And instead of sitting there on the beautiful bench that I built into this little, like a little nook, or on a small little wall, circular area where the paths come together, I never sit and enjoy those spots. I'm always going through, picking weeds, like cutting something here or looking to see if there's like an insect problem or disease problem. And I'm like, this is not the this is not what you're supposed to be doing. You should be out enjoying the garden.
Yeah.
Like that's something that's a goal of mine to actually quit working in the garden and start enjoying it, at least for a little bit at time. Because I do think that the English, like the normal English person, spends time and enjoys the
Mm.
experience in the garden. They're not constantly like trying to control it, weed it. So,
I have a kind of a closing question for you both, and we usually end our podcasts by asking like, what do you like to do outside of your work? But because of our topic today, I'm gonna ask something that I also think will shed light on who you guys are personally for our audience, but is also very related to this topic. And this could also be a very long answer. And, so if you're able to distill it down, but something I'm curious about from you both is when you arrive at a new garden that you're visiting, what is your approach to experiencing it? Like, do you just launch yourself in and kind of go where your eyes are drawn first? Because that's what I usually do. I don't have a plan of attack ahead of time. I'm just kind of like, I'm here and I'm gonna see some stuff and then I'm gonna leave. But I have a feeling that each of you, as lovers of design and big lovers of plants, have a little bit more, I don't know, maybe you don't, but maybe a more structured approach to visiting and experiencing these spaces. Can you share that with us in maybe a slightly shortened format?
I'll just jump in here quick. I think it depends for me. If I'm doing filming, I will, grab the garden map and I will look at it and I'll talk to the people who work there and, what are the things I absolutely don't want to miss, like I need to film. And I will say that when you're filming a garden, it's kind of like what I was saying about my own garden at home. You're not really experiencing it because you're filming.
Mhm.
Like there's a whole difference. So I try to do the filming and then put the camera away and maybe come back the next day and just walk the garden and experience it because it's a very different experience. So if I go someplace and I'm not filming, I just enter the garden and wander.
Hmm.
That I don't have a plan usually.
Um, yeah, I guess my answer is pretty similar. If it's a famous garden and there are certain vistas you want to see, I tend to make that a priority to make sure I get there. Um, I hate to say it because it's not great quality, but I tend to have that fear of missing out when I go to places. So I do usually take the map and try to hit everything. But it's a very happy day if I can go through the garden once. Um, and take pictures and see it. I have used a lot of the photographs for work projects, like the online courses that we wrote, that you were all a part of. A lot of those pictures for the design course came from my trips to Europe and from and gardens in the US as well. But so there's that element of I want to take pictures. I might be able to use this for work, but it's really wonderful. Most of these gardens in UK in particular will have a cafe where you
Yes.
can sit and relax, and I highly recommend having a cream tea, which is where you get a
Ooh.
tea with a scone with a little jar of jam and clotted cream. And you sit and relax a little bit. And then usually after I have that, I'll go back to the garden like Margaret does, try to keep my phone in my pocket and just take it in.
Mm.
For me, if I can, hate to say this, but spend a little time just by myself without other people, and without the phone, just taking it in, and not worrying about if I'm slowing anybody down or if someone else is bored. That's that's the key time. So I hate to say it, but if you love plants and your travel companions don't, send them to a museum or something else they'll like so you can just kind of take it in. And if you want to spend, 15 minutes looking at a certain moss or a fern that you've never seen, you have the time to do it. When I went to England in April, I got to spend the entire day at Wisley by myself. And instead of worrying about when are we going to eat, when do we need to do this, when do we need to leave, I they had a lot of these like what do they call them? Uh, walls made in England a lot of times instead of using like plastic stakes or manufactured staking materials, they'll use twigs and sticks. And they'll weave them together to make like these little domes so the perennials can grow up through them and support them. You don't see a whole lot of human-made manufactured plant supports. And so I just spent time taking pictures and examining how they wove these pieces of willow or birch together to make these little things. And then they had these like I can't remember the right name, like bed walls where they'll make like fencing materials for the landscape, kind of little dividing sections that they pound a couple dead pieces of wood into the ground, and then they'll fill up between these layers with sticks and things, and it makes shelter for wildlife. Not necessarily something we all want to have in our, like some of us have too much wildlife. I wouldn't necessarily want it close to my house, but they'll use, instead of like hauling it off to a compost facility, they made all these walls out of um, just natural materials that were there. And I just got to spend time checking that out, looking at how did they actually put that together so it would be stable, which is something that's hard to do if you have a bunch of other people around you. So um, that's, I don't know, that's one of my takeaways is just getting to actually look at, yeah, I got to see the beautiful aesthetic. Here's how it looks from 40 feet away, 20 feet away. But getting to look up close, like, how did they prune this? Like, where did they make that cut? Because some of the horticultural skills you'll see there are just pretty impressive. And I've learned a lot about what I need to learn more about by looking at the way different people have done things. So yeah, just taking the time to look close.
Mm, yeah.
You
Oh,
know, one
appreciate.
thing I want to just interject is that one of the advantages of filming, especially when you're using an 360 camera, because it looks different, right? And then you're setting up, you set up your shots on a tripod, and I usually try to hide so I'm not always in the picture. And then I just use my phone to take the shots, right? And I get so many interactions with the people who work in these gardens because they have no idea what I'm doing, right? And so it's a great icebreaker. And I get to talk to the professionals there and then talk to like the garden they're working in or the section of the garden they're working in and what is their background. And they asked me about gardens in the States, and like one of them was going to be going to work at Longwood Gardens in like 2 months for like an exchange program. And um, it's just like people I probably wouldn't have met or had a chance to talk to if I didn't have this weird looking camera and be on my phone, taking pictures
Yeah.
or hiding behind plants. And they're like, what is she doing hiding behind all those plants, while I'm taking the picture? And it's been a really good way to, yeah, meet people who are very knowledgeable about the gardens, spend some time talking to
That's a good tip. Like, do something a little bit strange in the
them.
gardens, so people will come
Exactly.
up to you.
Not too
Uh,
strange, Margaret. You might be put in the slammer, so you
It's
got to
a
be a little
fine
careful
line.
there.
Yeah. Wow, I love that. Thank you both for sharing your approach because I think you can tell a lot about a person about, and their relationship to plants and landscapes about how they sort of visit these places. I feel I can't speak for you, Tom, but I feel very inspired by our conversation to go and visit some of these places. And maybe you'll give us a map or a list of your highlights so that we can use it in the future. Um, but thank you both so much for being here and sharing such wonderful experiences and information. It's just so clear how much you both love this, travel, visiting these spaces and how much sort of reverence you have for them. So it's really nice to hear. And yeah, thank you. Thank you for sharing with us.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, take care, everybody.